We swore that we would never forgive them and that we would never allow something like this to happen again. These are the final moments of Major League Baseball before the famous 1994 strike. For those of us who lived through this period, these are really painful memories. But could baseball be headed for yet another work stoppage? You see, the problem that we have is that the current collective bargaining agreement ends on December 1st, 2026. Now, the problem is this. There are teams in Major League Baseball with salaries that are far below other teams, and teams with low payrolls basically have no competitive chance. The teams with the highest payrolls, meanwhile, tend to always be competitive. You could look at this chart, which comes from Brooksgate on Twitter, and reflects salary levels at the start of the 2025 season. The Mets, Dodgers, Phillies, and Yankees had very large payrolls. In fact, their individual payrolls surpassed the combined payrolls of the Marlins, White Sox, and Rays. And that's the reason why the owners are asking for a salary cap. But of course, salary caps are not really designed to give you competitive balance. Now, they are a formal type of collusion, one in which the owners pledge not to spend above a certain amount of money for free agents or salaries. And that's the reason why there's so much fighting over this. Bryce Harper's anger at Commissioner Manfred in July wasn't because he feels like he's underpaid. No, for the players, it's about principle, and it's about ensuring that they get what they feel is a fair share of the profits. The owners, meanwhile, argue that the only way to stop the financial discrepancy is to prohibit teams like the Dodgers, Yankees, and Mets from spending so much more than other teams. Now, if baseball were to finally get a salary cap, it's only natural to expect that there would also be a salary floor to go along with it. This would force teams like the Marlins and the Pirates to actually spend money. But, as Tony Clark has correctly said, a salary cap is an artificial limiter designed solely to limit player salaries. It's the lack of a free market for baseball players, especially free agents, that the MLBPA is worried about, not so much whether a salary floor is fair or not. Now, the problem with the way the reporters talk about this subject is that they're only looking at this from a limited time frame, a limited point of view. So if you take a step back and you look at the entire history of baseball, you'll start to understand what's really going on here. So let's do that. Let's take the step back and let's take a look and see what we can find. This article from 1857 marks the beginning of the old National Association of Baseball Players, the first organization of its kind. Notice again that date, 1857, which is 6 years before the foundation of the Football Association in England. The old National Association was an amateur organization and spent most of its time talking about the basic rules of the game. For example, whether it should be determined by the first team to make 21 runs or the final score after a set number of innings. Now, back in those days, there simply was no professional baseball. Well, not officially, that is. Professionalism did exist, and it existed because some teams could earn money by charging spectators for admission. And, if you've got money coming in, you naturally want to spend some of it to get the best possible product you can, or, in other words, to pay under the table for the best players. Well, back in those days, it was common for the biggest star players like Jim Creighton to be paid money. Creighton played for Excelsior of Brooklyn, a supposedly amateur club filled with secretly paid star players that came close to winning the abbreviated 1860 championship season. Now, the game was indeed different in those days, but it was still more or less baseball. And the question of professionalism wound up becoming a big problem before too long. In 1868, the old National Association decided to split teams into two classes, professionals and amateurs. That led to the formal creation of what we know of as the National Association in 1871, which was formed to deal strictly with professional players. The older association wound up being strictly for amateur clubs. But there were problems. Teams were started and folded, and there were huge salary discrepancies. Sound familiar? And that's the reason why the National League was formed. The National League was formed in 1875 among cries in the press that there were simply too many clubs. The idea was to form a cartel, a national league with strict rules for entry, one in which only teams from large cities would be allowed to field a single club. The National League also created a rule prohibiting cities from having more than one team. The idea was to create territorial monopolies, and these happen to be the same territorial monopoly rights that prevent you today from, for example, legally streaming games of your hometown team over the internet live. In fact, the only reason why you see some cities with more than one team is because of challenges to this policy by rival major leagues. Part of the formation of this new cartel was figuring out a way to restrict player movement, which of course was one of the reasons to limit the number of teams in the league. This eventually resulted in the so-called Reserve Clause of 1879. That was a clause that bound players to their club forever and completely eliminated free agency. There are reports that the Reserve Clause started as a reaction to the same thing that we see today, one team buying up all the good players. But honestly, it doesn't really matter what the excuse was. What matters is that the Reserve Clause was created and that it shaped the culture of the game in very profound ways. Now, there were attempts by the players to fight back, such as the formation of the famous Players' League, which only lasted for the 1890 season. The Players' League fell apart, partially because the investors wanted a quick return on their investment and were impatient. It also failed, interestingly enough, because player salaries ate too much into the potential team profits. Or in other words, it looks like a system with something like a reserve clause is perhaps necessary for teams to be profitable. Well, at least that's the mindset that we have in the United States and Canada around sports. Anyway, that Players' League likely indirectly led to the fall of the old American Association, after which the National League's monopoly on the sport was set in stone. People hated the National League, and so there were rumors of a new American Association springing up throughout the 1890s. The idea, naturally, was to invade the territory of the National League, no longer respect the reserve rule, and enter into a bidding war for star players. And that eventually happened. It happened when Ban Johnson turned the old Western League into the American League in 1900. Now, there are those of you who are old enough to remember when there was a real and a meaningful rivalry between the American and National Leagues. Well, this is where that rivalry originally came from. But that rivalry that we remember from like the 70s, 60s, 50s is nothing compared to what it was around 1901. In October 1899, before the National League season was finished, the Western League decided to change its name to the American League. This was a few months before the famous contraction took place. This article, which announces the contraction of 4 clubs, was not published until March 1900, right before spring training started. Anyway, that should give you an idea of just how powerful the National League was. The owners, with all of their syndicate shenanigans, were able to buy teams up and basically dissolve them overnight. And since they were the ones really running the league, the owners, they could do whatever they wanted without any repercussions. Plus, of course, fewer teams meant fewer players to pay and fewer options for the players who still had major league jobs. Though most people don't talk about them, the Brooklyn Superbas won the 1900 National League pennant. The Superbas were known as a dirty team. They were made up of old members of the now defunct Baltimore Orioles who were known for deliberately bending the rules to win. Of course, the most famous of the old Orioles was John McGraw, a kid in his early 20s who was so smart and capable that he managed the team. Now, while all of this was going on, Ban Johnson somehow got the Chicago National League Club to allow him to put an American League club in Chicago. This is one of the most remarkable feats of the early history of baseball. This blatant violation of the so-called territorial rights of the Chicago team set the stage for the formation of the American League as a major league, and is probably the most important and significant development in baseball in all of the 1900s. The Chicago White Stockings, of course, won the 1900 American League pennant, and they wound up winning the 1901 pennant as well. And it was really in 1901 that the major bidding wars started. Now, the way that the American League rose to power came because of that John McGraw, the old Oriole. And you really have to understand the story of John McGraw to understand how the reserve clause wound up sticking in baseball for so long. McGraw was upset that the Orioles were contracted after the 1899 season. Now, John McGraw was arguably the best player in the National League in 1899. Instead of signing with Brooklyn like the other Orioles did, McGraw decided to hold out and wound up being traded to St. Louis. In fact, McGraw's holdout was one of the biggest baseball stories of the early 1900 season, and it lasted until the season was over a month old. It wasn't until mid-May 1900 that McGraw got the contract he was looking for, and of course, notice in the St. Louis newspaper that the American League standings were listed as well, even though there was no American League team in St. Louis. Interesting stuff. Anyway, McGraw got a salary of $10,000, which was a fortune in those days, but the most important part was that the contract contained no reserve clause at all. I'm not aware of any other player at that time or later that was able to negotiate away the reserve clause in the contract the way that John McGraw did. Now that tells you something, not just about McGraw's playing ability, but also something about his intellect. My understanding is that McGraw was able to accomplish this completely on his own. After all, this is long before the days of sports agents. Now, by late July 1900, there were rumors that John McGraw was going to become the new manager of the St. Louis club. That's incredible. He went from holding out until May to rumors of taking over the club before August. In late August, manager Pat Thibault resigned, and everybody was convinced that McGraw was the new manager of the club. Now, Baseball Reference in the history books will tell you that the real manager was actually Louis Heilbronner, who had no managerial experience and who never managed again afterwards. But I think that you and I can guess who was really in charge. Now, as funny and full of rumors as that was, everything after that point becomes just a little bit fuzzier. In October 1900, John McGraw started telling the press that there was sure to be a new club in Baltimore. He also heavily insinuated that he was going to run this new club. A week later, Ban Johnson announced that the American League would put teams into National League cities and would no longer be considered a minor league. I would argue that the 1900 American League really should have been considered a major league since it did not conform to the rules of the minor league player draft that the other minor leagues conform to. In fact, if you look at the roster of the 1900 Chicago White Stockings and the 1901 White Stockings, the rosters are almost identical. And in the end, McGraw got the blessing from Johnson to start a team in Baltimore, one that McGraw filled up with his old friends from the old Orioles. And the bidding war was on, which was the most important part for players. Well, look at this editorial cartoon from Philadelphia from 1901. Johnson was presented as a sort of Abraham Lincoln figure, freeing the enslaved players from the bondage of the National League. This is what many of the players saw in the new American League. However, both McGraw and Johnson had very strong personalities. McGraw loved a good rhubarb, and Johnson loved to suspend him for arguing. And it was in the middle of June 1902 that McGraw took advantage of a suspension to meet with Andrew Friedman, the owner of the New York Giants of the National League. In mid-July of 1902, McGraw officially jumped from Baltimore to New York. And this was a problem. You see, McGraw actually owned a big chunk of the Baltimore team, and he transferred those shares to the New York Giants. And then he practically took like every player on the roster with him. This blow had the potential to completely destroy the American League for good. Ban Johnson responded by arranging for other American League teams to loan players to the Orioles. He immediately started to make arrangements to have the Orioles moved from Baltimore to New York City in an act of revenge. That's where our New York Yankees come from. But most importantly, McGraw's defection led directly to the peace of 1903 and the establishment of the reserve clause as a policy in both leagues. Or, in other words, players could no longer play the two leagues off each other to get the salaries that they wanted. You see, the blow of having an entire team basically stolen by the other league was so heavy that it simply wasn't worth carrying on this war anymore. And no matter what some historians think about him, the truth is that Ban Johnson was certainly no saint. He was no holy man. He was no different from the other National League owners. All of these guys were all in for the money, and they would do anything to control players' salaries. And that's the reality that we had for decades. Now, there were three things that players could do in the old days to fight against the reserve clause. One was to hope for the establishment of another major league, such as the famous Federal League. There were actually quite a few of these leagues over the years. For example, there was this 1908 Union League, which I guarantee you've never heard of. That league folded in early June after suffering huge financial losses. The Federal League, of course, caused all sorts of problems, but had to close its doors when its major antitrust lawsuit was delayed. The judge in that Federal League case, by the way, was somebody you've probably heard of, and yes, this story is just as corrupt as you think it is. Anyway, the second option the players had was to go crooked, Black Sox style. If you can't get the money you think you're worth from the owners, you might as well find some other place to get it. These scandals were actually pretty commonplace in the 1910s and 20s, and they did threaten to destroy the public's trust in the game. And there's a reason why Commissioner Landis went scorched earth on those players. The sport simply could not thrive if the public couldn't trust its results. The third option the players had was the old John McGraw option, to simply hold out and refuse to report to the team until the players' demands were met. While McGraw was clearly the most successful holdout in history, Hannes Wagner was probably the most significant. Wagner held out for 3 games into the 1908 season, after which he turned in one of the greatest offensive seasons in the history of the game. The newspapers report that he succeeded in getting the $10,000 contract for that season that he was looking for, though I'm not sure if that figure is correct. Babe Ruth, by the way, held out before his famous 1927 season looking for a little bit more money. The Babe's leverage was a film contract that he had signed that off-season, though of course nobody seriously thought that the Babe was going to quit baseball for the movies. In the end, Babe got $70,000 a year and rewarded the Yankees with 60 home runs and a world championship. More recently, before the 1966 season, Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale famously held out together. This was the ultimate game of chicken, with both players flatly refusing the so-called final offers that the team gave them. And in the end, it paid off for both of them. You see, the reserve clause really couldn't do anything about those irreplaceable players. I mean, Babe Ruth, Hannes Wagner, Sandy Koufax, those guys were always going to have enough leverage to get the money that they wanted, just like Bryce Harper today. Teams just can't replace guys like that. But it's the ordinary players who wind up suffering. And that's what the baseball labor movement has always been about, at least in theory, trying to make things better for all players. And so, under Marvin Miller, the MLBPA managed to get baseball's first collective bargaining agreement in early 1968, less than 2 years after that famous Koufax-Drysdale holdout. Baseball's first strike in April 1972 was all about an increase in pension fund payments, and the players were successful. The canceled games were never made up, which is why the Red Sox lost the American League East by half a game that season. And that was the formal beginning of baseball's labor pains, something that was once a regular feature of the sport. When Curt Flood protested being traded from St. Louis to Philadelphia in 1969, he set up a big showdown on the legality of the reserve clause. Though the details tend to be glossed over today, the truth is that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Major League Baseball. The roots of modern free agency came afterwards when Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally were declared free agents by an independent arbiter after playing full seasons without signing contracts. And if you look closely, you'll notice that every single labor dispute has something to do with the details surrounding free agency. Of course, threatening to go to war every time you don't get your way is a little bit extreme, isn't it? After all, why is it that there can't be lasting labor peace in the sport? Well, the problem goes back to that founding of the National League system, as I just explained. It's a system designed to reduce labor costs by any means necessary. This territorial monopoly aspect is especially problematic since not all territories are created equally. Teams like the New York Yankees will always have more money to spend because of the territorial market they control. Ideally, you'd want to put a ton of teams in New York City to divide up the fan base and make it so one team simply cannot dominate. Now, the NFL figured out a revenue-sharing system decades ago to eliminate these natural advantages that huge market teams enjoy, but baseball still hasn't figured any of this out. Of course, it's not like the poor teams in baseball are really poor. In fact, the real irony here is that financially, baseball has advanced by leaps and bounds since all of this fighting started. Well, this is obvious if you spend any time watching baseball games from a few decades ago. Not only are today's athletes better paid and in better shape, but their playing conditions have improved dramatically as well. Baseball is clearly richer and more successful now than it has ever been, and that's despite all the odd rules that we've added in recent years. It's the direct result of the old monopolistic National League system, which was specifically designed to eliminate competition and generate monopolistic profits for all club owners. It's not great for fans, but it really does generate a lot of cash. And so, even though I hate the monopolistic system and honestly wish that it wouldn't exist, I have to admit that it's not realistic to dream about a complete overhaul of the system. We're probably going to keep the current structure of the sport financially. Since that's the case, I'll make this blunt. We really need a salary cap. As long as that system is still around, we need a cap. And this time around, I really don't believe that the players can actually afford a long-term fight. Well, there's been all sorts of talk about the players having a big war chest again, similar to the one that they built up in 1994. Back in late 2021, there were rumors that the players had amassed some fantastically high account that could help pay the salaries of non-star players if there was a work stoppage. Rumor has it that this war chest is bigger than ever. I mean, it might be true, but I honestly don't believe it. In fact, any good journalist should be immediately skeptical of that claim. See, games like this no longer exist, for example. MLB The Show is a monopoly, and that means that the player's share of revenue is held back by the amount of games that Sony manages to sell. Baseball cards have also been monopolized for years now. That means that the MLBPA no longer has multiple contracts to milk for that revenue. In fact, most fans have forgotten that the awful 1994 strike was largely financed by the proceeds from the baseball cards that we loved to collect back in those days. So if we had another significant work stoppage, could the hobby collapse for good? Anyway, color me a skeptic. I don't think that the players have quite the strong position that they claim to have. However, I do think that any salary cap in the sport absolutely must come together with a salary floor. The reason, of course, is because you've otherwise got cities that are never competitive. So places like, say, Pittsburgh, which has been losing for, 30 years now? If you do nothing in towns like that, of course, eventually the money will stop coming in. As popular as baseball remains today, there's really no reason to believe that the good times will last forever. The sport needs labor peace to grow and to thrive. And it's frankly ridiculous to have to worry about work stoppages in this sport every couple of years. Anyway, I really think that it's finally time for a long-term labor agreement. And as much as I hate to say this, I think it's time for the salary cap and for the salary floor. But what do you think? Let me know down below.